Bonjour à tous et bonjour à toutes, bienvenue dans la matrescence. La matrescence, c'est la contraction du mot maternité et adolescence pour expliquer la naissance d'une mère. Et si vous voulez en savoir plus, il suffit d'écouter l'épisode numéro 1. Dans ce podcast, on parle du postpartum, du 4e trimestre, de la joie d'être parent, mais de ses difficultés aussi, bref, on parle de la vie. La matrescence met en avant des femmes et des hommes qui racontent, expliquent et donnent une autre définition à la parentalité, loin de l'image lisse et parfois filtrée aperçue sur les réseaux sociaux. Je suis Clémentine Sarlat, la créatrice de ce podcast. Je suis journaliste de formation dans le sport, à la télé, rien à voir, mais surtout maman d'une petite fille de 18 mois, Ella. Avec ce podcast, j'ai voulu mettre des mots sur le vécu des femmes, notamment autour de la maternité. La matrescence transforme la vie des mères, des pères, mais surtout des familles dans leur ensemble, alors parlons-en. Ici, pas de tabou, je vous propose chaque vendredi une conversation intime, pleine de rire, d'émotions et d'informations. Pour ce 9e épisode, on va parler neurosciences. Je suis extrêmement heureuse de pouvoir enfin aborder ce sujet ici. On va parler du fameux mommy brain, pour reprendre l'expression anglaise, ce cerveau maternel si méconnu en France. Premièrement, qu'est-ce que la plasticité du cerveau? Parce qu'on va en parler. La neuroplasticité, ou plasticité neuronale, en fait, elle peut se définir comme l'ensemble des manifestations traduisant la capacité des neurones à se modifier et à se remodeler tout au long de la vie. Vous l'aurez compris, le cerveau peut donc changer tout le temps et à tous les moments de notre vie et surtout au moment de la maternité. Jodie Pawluski, neurobiologiste spécialisée dans la maternité, est canadienne et elle est chercheuse à l'université de Rennes en France. Pour l'instant, elle ne maîtrise pas assez le français pour répondre à cet épisode dans notre langue, mais si vous comprenez bien l'anglais, n'hésitez pas, c'est passionnant. Toutes mes questions sont en français. Vous avez eu l'impression peut-être d'être complètement à côté de la plaque pendant votre grossesse et surtout après l'accouchement. Eh bien, rassurez-vous, c'est tout à fait normal. Le cerveau est extraordinaire car il s'adapte à cette étape de notre vie franchement dingue. Venez avec moi, je vous emmène dans le monde génial de la neuroscience. Bonjour Jodie, merci beaucoup d'avoir accepté de répondre à mes questions. Alors on va le faire en anglais pour toi, même si tu vis à Rennes pour l'instant, ça sera plus efficace avec toutes les informations en anglais. Donc je vais commencer par ma première question. Tu pourrais nous expliquer comment le cerveau d'une mère change après avoir eu un bébé?
Yes, and first of all, thank you, of course, for having me here, and it's great to talk about the parental brain. So how does the maternal brain change during pregnancy and the postpartum period? So we're beginning to show that there are many changes occurring during pregnancy and the postpartum period, particularly postpartum, in a woman's brain that are normal and that are natural. And one thing that's been shown in the human literature with imaging studies and as well as in the animal literature is that there seems to be a refinement. We're talking about this more as a refinement, but in fact, in the human literature, if you'll see the papers, there's a deactivation in many areas of the brain that are communicating together. And so when people think there's a deactivation or there's fewer cells, as we've shown in the animal literature with the postpartum period, I mean, isn't that bad? And in fact, I think it's actually a natural change, and it's a potentially really great thing. And we know that, of course, most women are happily interacting with their children in the postpartum period and performing all those maternal behaviors that are important. So we like to think of this change in the brain as, in fact, a refinement, fine-tuning of the circuitry. We talk about a maternal circuit coming online, which involves many different areas of the brain that interact together for eliciting behaviors between the mother and her response to the infant. And these brain areas, we know the amygdala is really important, the prefrontal cortex, the nucleus accumbens, and the hippocampus, for example, as well as many other areas that coordinate different maternal behaviors.
Ça veut dire que le cortex frontal prend moins de place et c'est la partie où les émotions sont plus fortes qui sont mis en avant?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think we're seeing, well, differences in the communication between different brain areas, probably dependent also on the environment. So, your prefrontal cortex is important for decision making, which you have to make. But the amygdala, of course, is processing and emotions and fear. And I would have to say, I don't know if we know this in detail, but I'm going to say that it's going to be in response to different environmental cues. So I would anticipate, I mean, it's very natural to have a little bit more anxiety during the postpartum period, to be more aware of your environment. So that would be related to the amygdala. But of course, you have to make a decision as to whether or not it's important for you to do something in that environment. So I think there's an more of a sensitivity to environmental cues because now you're protecting a child that is helpless essentially, and you're more aware of how different environmental factors can affect you and that child. But not everyone. Each experience is also different. So some people feel really calm and happy and chill in the postpartum period. Other people a bit more anxious and what have you. So there's a wide variety of what's normal to experience.
Ce qui est difficile, c'est peut-être de faire attention entre la dépression postpartum et ce qui est normal de ressentir comme sentiment un peu de tourbillon quand on vient d'être maman.
Yeah, and I think this is a great question, and this is something that Alexandria Sachs, she wrote this book, just came out about understanding your emotions during pregnancy and the postpartum period, and she really started using the term matrescence, which is come online, and I think is a great term to describe the transition from pregnancy and the postpartum period, just like adolescence. So you go through puberty. When you become a mom, that's another huge change and event in your life. And matrescence is a great word to describe this. But after hearing her talk a little bit as well, and I have her book, which I have yet to read. I just got it in the mail last week. But she's talking about this normal change in emotions, which is okay. But it's only when you're super anxious or you're super depressed and it's interfering with your day-to-day functioning, that then you have a mental illness. But that being said, if you feel at all not right, and you should go talk to someone. So there's no shame in getting extra help. There's no shame in having some support for your mental and physical health, because mental health is physical health. And I always say, like, a healthy mom is a healthy baby. So what's also interesting is in the postpartum period, making sure that you're feeling that you're getting the support you need is really important as a parent. So it's okay to have time away from your child, and it's okay to cry once in a while or be super happy and all these things. It's okay to have a range, but it's when it's starting to cause problems, you're going to have really negative thinking patterns and what have you, that you definitely need to search out some support and some help. But the good thing is, on that note, is that many women who suffer from disorders during pregnancy and the postpartum period, there are a lot of options for treatment that are very effective. And so that's also really good to know.
Est-ce que se rendre compte qu'on est différent avoir eu un bébé, est-ce que c'est bon signe? Est-ce que ça veut dire aussi qu'on est en train d'entrer dans une relation forte d'attachement avec son bébé?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. And I think I don't really know the right answer to that question. I mean, some people really feel overjoyed with the birth of their child. Most people do, and feel like they're bonding with that child. Other people do feel this like a more severe identity crisis or a change in their lifestyle, which causes some disconnect sometimes with the child as well. So I'd have to say just to be aware that there's a range of different emotions, and they can be reflective of how you're bonding with the child or not. But just to, the key is to understand that there is a normal range. But if you're feeling really uncomfortable with how you've been feeling and you think that that's a little bit off, or if, you need to reach out for some help. And I think mama blues here in France is a good resource as well. But in terms of that bonding, yeah, I mean, I don't know. It's a good question.
On parlait aussi du fait, est-ce qu'il y a des études qui montrent que la façon dont on naît, est-ce que c'est une césarienne, est-ce que c'est une naissance par voie basse, est-ce qu'on a allaité ou pas, ça change le cerveau différemment?
Yes. So there's been, there's been a little bit of research in this area looking at how the environment or the birth experience, so cesarean versus vaginal delivery or lactation versus bottle feeding, affects the maternal brain. Now, this is really interesting because it is showing that there are changes, and there is some work showing that mom who gave birth by cesarean has a little bit different brain response to her infant compared to a mom who had a vaginal delivery or one that breastfeeds versus not breastfeeding. So it's really, for me, I think this is interesting because it shows how much the environment can interact with the maternal brain responses, but also to keep in mind that this doesn't mean that if you had a cesarean delivery that something's wrong or not with you. It just means that there's some differences. So I think there's no problems with parents bonding regardless of breastfeeding, not breastfeeding, cesarean versus vaginal delivery, because this is also a learned process. But it is interesting to note that these factors can play a role in how our brains are changing during the postpartum period.
Il y a beaucoup, beaucoup de choses à étudier.
Yeah, so this is the thing. There are so many things different researchers have just touched on different factors, but we don't have the complete story yet. And, there's more questions than there are answers. And I think it's really important, and I would say that there are definitely researchers interested in this area, but there's never enough money to support funding in this area. And we're beginning to see more interest in the parental brain and changes in the postpartum period, but we need to have more interest and more support from funding agencies to do this work.
Et est-ce que les pères ont aussi le cerveau qui évolue dans ce genre de situation?
Yeah. So, one thing we are seeing, which is interesting as well, is that there are changes in the paternal brain in the fathers with the transition to parenthood as well. And some of those changes in the brain are in the same brain areas as what you see in mothers, but the changes aren't as remarkable as what you'd see in a postpartum mother, for example. I mean, this is most likely due to the fact that a mom who's given birth and been pregnant and given birth has so many hormonal changes during pregnancy, birth, and postpartum period. But dads also show some changes in hormone levels during pregnancy and in the postpartum period. Not as huge, but there is a little bit of research showing that there's a decrease in testosterone, for example, during this time as they're bonding with their child as well.
Oh, c'est intéressant.
Yeah. And one thing I also want to note is we are beginning to see there's a little bit of research showing that that other people who are primary caregivers, so your partner or adoptive parent or foster parent, also shows some brain changes with this parenting experience as well. So it's not just unique to a biological parent, and I think that's really important to remember, because I always say that anyone can parent, because essentially we learn how to parent. If there's not a gene for it, a mom doesn't give birth and becomes a super mom. And in fact, we are learning as we go.
And the brain too. Et le cerveau aussi.
Yes, definitely.
Et est-ce que pour un deuxième ou un troisième bébé, les changements, ils sont aussi forts?
Yeah, so this is a really great question. And this is something we don't know about in the human literature. There hasn't been any imaging data that I know of to date that has looked at first time versus second time versus third time parent. But this is actually something I investigated in animal models during my doctoral thesis, where I was interested in the hippocampus, which is an area of the brain important for working memory and spatial memory, as well as plays a role in stress responsivity. But it has a high degree of new neurons being produced throughout the lifespan. So I was interested in if there is a difference between a non-mother rat, a mother rat for a first time, and a second time mother rat in this area of the brain, as well as in their memory performance. And what my research showed was that the first time mother had enhancements in memory performance that were long after the time of weaning compared to the second time mother and the non-mother, and also that this first time mother had more significant changes in the hippocampus, in the neuroplasticity in the hippocampus, as well as more significant changes in steroid hormones compared to the second time mother as well as the virgin. But the second time mother also showed some changes, but not at the same magnitude as the first time mother. So this kind of follows some of the work in the animal literature, primarily by Alison Fleming, talking about maternal memory and how the first time you develop this memory for how to respond to your offspring, and then the second time it comes online faster, for example, or in a different way, but it's there already. So the first time is really just setting up this maternal circuitry, maternal brain, maternal memory, and then the second time it comes online faster. But of course, in humans, we don't know exactly what it looks like the second time. And of course, the second time you also have your first child and your second child. Whereas in the animal literature, you often in these studies, they're not housed together with their offspring after the first few
Pourquoi
weeks.
est-ce qu'on ne sait pas sur les deuxièmes enfants, il n'y a pas d'études là-dessus?
Yeah, so in terms of the imaging research, I don't know if anyone has specifically looked at reproductive experience. And I think there's a couple reasons for this. I mean, as I mentioned earlier, there's never enough money to do these studies. So that's a big problem. But also logistically, sometimes it's quite difficult to get participants in. If they have their first child, it's often easier because they bring the baby in to participate in a study. But if they have two children, then you have two children you might have to also bring into the study as well. And sometimes it's harder to do that, or people, as you have more children, you often get busier, perhaps with different activities and things like that. So it becomes more difficult to have participants in the lab. And also another factor that I'm sure researchers in this area have thought about is the fact that you might have a 5-year-old and then a newborn, or a 2-year-old and a newborn. And so the age of your child and the difference in the age between your two children could be a factor as well. But needless to say, I think it's a study that needs to be done. I think we need to look at first time versus second time, or first time versus third time parent, and see what's going on there.
Donc ça veut dire que c'est intéressant, ça veut dire que si jamais on a eu deux enfants très rapprochés avec peut-être 18 mois d'écart, et on sait que c'est difficile d'avoir des enfants avec aussi peu d'écart, ou une différence de 5 ans, ça peut avoir un impact différent sur le cerveau.
Yeah, so definitely. I think that there's so many differences between, a 5-year-old and a 2-year-old and an infant. So yeah, definitely having like that, the difference in time could be a huge factor in how the brain is responding to the second. Also, you have to think, I mean, I had my children 20 months apart. And so I was breastfeeding, in fact, into my second trimester with my second child, and then I stopped. And so there's also those factors and different physiological changes. And often it takes people a longer time postpartum to get back to how they felt prepartum, if that you ever do. But and then if you have a second one right away, there's definitely perhaps more pronounced changes, or perhaps it's easier. I don't know. We don't know. But it's a good thing to think about, is definitely the age of the first versus the second could be a factor in how the brain's changing.
Récemment, j'ai beaucoup vu passer des femmes, des mamans poser des questions sur le fait d'arrêter d'allaiter ou d'arrêter très brutalement avait un impact sur leur santé mentale. Est-ce qu'on étudie ça aussi?
Yeah, so in terms of the brain, the neurobiological changes and lactation, I don't know of anyone doing this, but I do know that there are definitely researchers looking at the emotions connected with lactation and stopping lactation. So what's interesting about this literature as well is that there are women who, in fact, feel depressed while they're lactating, and when they stop, they feel much better. And then there are women who become severely depressed when they stop breastfeeding. So it's a complicated process. I think breastfeeding itself it's a great thing if it's you're able to do it, but there's so many challenges around breastfeeding for many people, and so much we don't know about breastfeeding that I mean, it's another huge area that should be studied in more detail. But there
Ouais.
are definitely emotional connections there with
Et est-ce
lactation.
que tu sais pourquoi personne en France ne parle vraiment du cerveau de la mère, et pourquoi c'est pas quelque chose qui est un sujet commun?
Talking about the parental brain or maternal health in general hasn't been something that people have been talking about much anywhere in the world over the past 10 years, for example. But a couple of years ago, I think with the growing research in the area and some key reviews of the literature, there's been a lot of talk, especially in the United States and Canada, about changes in the maternal brain in particular. And there's been a lot of talk about this in the literature and magazines and newspapers. In France, I think it's following a little bit behind, maybe because there's more researchers studying the parental brain in the United States, that there's more talk about it. Here in France, it's a different culture and different focus, but I think we need to talk more about maternal health, maternal mental health, parental mental health, the parental brain, not only in France, but across Europe as well, just globally. I mean, we need to talk about the physiological changes that happen throughout the body during pregnancy and the postpartum period, and that includes the brain. And I think it's unfortunate because sometimes we talk about mental health and then we talk about physical health, and they're the same thing. And essentially our brain is our body. So we can't really talk about one without talking about the other, and we need to start doing that
Évidemment,
more.
si je te pose cette question, c'est parce que je suis en train de t'interviewer en anglais, que tu écris tous tes articles en anglais, que tu as participé à beaucoup d'articles aux États-Unis. Et en France, on n'a pas accès à ces informations en français, en langue française. Est-ce que tu sais pourquoi?
Yeah, so this is a good question. One thing is, in general, science generally is in English publications. So if there's experts in France doing research in this, they would be talking about this in English, but also, I would hope, have a press release in French. So why isn't this important? I mean, because there aren't really books for moms in French, are there? Like, there's not.
No.
There's like Bringing Up Baby, that's in French, that's in English.
Yeah, we don't have. Well, no, we have good books, but not for postpartum. That's a problem.
Yeah. So you know what? In fact, I would have to say that although there's been a lot more talk about the maternal brain and brain changes and maternal mental health in Anglophone world, the UK, the States, and Canada, and Australia as well, that in fact there isn't really a book for moms about their mental health during the postpartum period, not even in English. So for all the talk of the research and all this stuff, I believe that Alexandria Sachs' book is the first one that really addresses emotional changes and is really for moms. It's not what to expect when you're expecting. It's not your baby at week 2. It's actually about you as a mother. And that's made for moms. It's not a textbook. It's nothing. It's just actually real talk about what's going on in the postpartum in terms of mental health. And so in that regard, we're all lagging behind. It doesn't matter what language we speak. We are actually doing a really bad job of bringing awareness to changes in mental health, bringing awareness about changes in the brain, the body. I mean, more so we're lacking in the brain education, but we need to educate women about their bodies and the changes, the good changes, the bad changes, and then talk about it. So I think we're all falling behind. We could do better, basically.
Tu en as parlé un peu tout à l'heure, le mommy brain, comme on dit en anglais, donc c'est le cerveau maternel. Et souvent, c'est étiqueté d'une façon très négative, comme si on n'était plus nous-mêmes, on oubliait tout, donc on était pas des moins que rien, mais c'est vrai que ça a une connotation assez négative. Comment est-ce qu'on fait pour changer le paradigme et en parler de façon positive, comme quoi c'est quelque chose de bien?
Yes, this is also a really great question about mommy brain, because we often think of these negative, things that happen during pregnancy and the postpartum period. We're forgetting things, or we can't find the right word to say, or what have you. But we also need to remember that we're learning a whole bunch of things that are really positive. And so I think we talk about mommy brain because there are these negative components that we're focusing on, for example, but then we're forgetting that we're learning so many new things and that we're taking care of an infant. Like this little thing just came out of us, and we're sorting out how to care for them appropriately, and we're learning how to do it, and we're not forgetting to do it, and we're taking care of them and giving them proper nutrition, and we're hopefully taking care of ourselves as well. So I think we need to reframe our idea about mommy brain and start thinking about all the positive things. And there was that article in Elle.com recently, I can't remember the author now, but she mentioned how she was forgetting words or forgetting things like, that those were interrupting her life. But then at the end of the day, she had been so busy and she had in fact accomplished so many things. And so I think we need to put a positive swing on parenting and think about all the things we are doing. And sure, like doing the laundry or bathing the baby or, getting the groceries don't seem like a big thing, but those are all important things that you can do throughout your day. And I think we're doing more things as new parents than we are. Well, we're not congratulating ourselves enough for all the things we are accomplishing.
Je me trompe peut-être, mais est-ce que c'est pas lié au fait qu'on vit dans une société un peu patriarcale où la maternité est pas toujours très bien vue?
Yeah, so I think you're right to some degree. We don't have a matriarchal society. I mean, I also think because women will often say they'll complain of verbal memory deficits during late pregnancy and the postpartum period, for example. So they might not be able to find the right word for a sentence. And for me, I think, well, you know what? That's actually not that big of a deal because you have all these other things to do. But for others, that might be not as acceptable because it's like you can't even say what you mean or what have you. So there could be a negative connotation around that. But I think we just need to accept that the natural changes are occurring. And perhaps it's because of our culture and our society to some degree that we're not, especially in the Western society, we're not letting moms recover from birth, if that makes sense. Like I feel sometimes there's an expectation just to go, do. And I don't think that we need to do that. We can just kind of chill out and hang out with our baby if that's what we want to do. Each person should be allowed to make a choice of how they want their postpartum to be. But I don't think there needs to be a rush to do a whole bunch of things. You can just sit, enjoy your postpartum, and let yourself adapt to this new environment.
Il y a une pression pour les femmes quand même de repartir vite, de toujours faire, de tout faire comme avant et d'être joyeuse et de repartir travailler avec envie et d'avoir le corps d'avant. Ça fait beaucoup.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of expectations about this. And some women, for sure, the day they give birth, they're happy to go home if they didn't birth at home and get on with their life. Some women need 6 weeks. Some women probably need 6 months, a year, what have you. So I think there's a lot of expectations of trying to get back to pre-pregnancy body, and lifestyle, but also having a child, and which you've completely changed your life. And that's great. You can still do all the things that you enjoyed beforehand, but maybe not as often, maybe a little bit differently, and what have you. So I think it's a changing environment. It's a changing lifestyle, but it doesn't mean you have to give up what you had before, but it could take longer or could be different how your life is now with a child. But there's definitely huge cultural pressures, especially when it comes to body image, to get back to how you were before.
Si on doit un peu faire le tour de la conversation, c'est surtout les mamans qui vont avoir un premier enfant qu'il faut informer de tous ces changements dans le cerveau, non?
I agree. I definitely think we need more education about what's normal and natural and healthy with a transition to pregnancy in the postpartum period. a healthy range of emotions is normal. There are definitely changes going on in your brain, which are normal, which are super important. And that also goes along with the changes that are going on in your body. You just can't maybe see them, but in terms of emotions, for example, you can feel them. And it's important to feel them and to understand that they are okay. And not everyone's happy when they're pregnant all the time, and they're not always happy in the postpartum. And that's also normal to some degree.
Et j'ai une question qui pour moi est importante, avec ton avis de neuroscientifique et de Canadienne. En France, dès qu'on aborde le sujet de la maternité, il y a toujours la question du féminisme qui vient autour. C'est assez compliqué. Et c'est difficile de trouver la balance, une vraie balance, un vrai équilibre plutôt, entre le fait d'être féministe, mais d'être mère aussi, de ce que ça veut dire de pas être renvoyée qu'à ce rôle. C'est quoi ton regard là-dessus?
I do believe that anyone can be a parent. And in my household, my husband can do anything that I can do except not breastfeed, but he can take a bottle and feed the baby, or he could. We have older children now. So I think that we need to acknowledge that anyone can parent. Just because a woman gives birth doesn't mean that she is needs to be the primary caregiver. I also think, though, that women, of course, do give birth. And so having a little bit of time to sort themselves out after birth and decide when they want to go back to work is appropriate. I mean, you gave birth. It's a big event that happens in your life. But I definitely think that if a woman wants to go back to work, the dad can stay home too. I mean, for me, we have to think of parenting as parenting, not as being mother or father, but it's a partnership between two individuals. It's not a woman's role. It's a society's role, or it's the couple's role in the immediate family. So in terms of, for me, I mean, I'm also a working mom, and I've kind of sorted it out how it works best for me and my family. But I also want to say on this note, I fully support women going back to work when they want. This is great. But I also realize that we live in a Western society, where it's often the man who's making more money. So it makes more sense, if you have child care costs, for the woman to stay home if you want to minimize those costs. Maybe less so in France, but for example, in the States, there are often couples, and even in Canada, where childcare is so expensive and the man is making more money, because we know there's usually always this gender discrepancy in income. So then the woman ends up staying home with the child and maybe going back to work when the child started school at age 5 in Canada, typically. So I think this is a bigger issue than just a choice. There's a lot of different factors. It's not just a choice for a woman to decide to go back to work or not, but often society has already made that choice for her, because if her husband's making more money, then it makes sense for him to stay working while she takes care of the kids. I mean, in France, you have a lot of good childcare options, so that it's a little bit different here. But I also do know there is also that whole, there is that pressure. You're the mom. You should be with the child. That exists, and it will probably always exist to some degree. We have this expectation that the mom knows best when it comes to the child, and I don't think that that's true. I think the moms maybe learnt a lot because she spent a lot of time with the child, but it doesn't mean that anybody else can't do what she can do.
Merci beaucoup, Jodie. C'était très intéressant. Je vais tout faire pour que ce soit compréhensible en français. Et j'espère refaire un épisode avec toi plus tard, quand tu parleras français et tu seras à l'aise. Et surtout quand on aura découvert encore plein d'autres choses, puisque de ce que j'ai compris, tu as plein de découvertes à faire. Il y a plein d'études encore à faire autour de mommy brain et de la santé mentale des mères. Merci, Jodie.
Merci beaucoup.
Merci à tous et à toutes d'avoir écouté cet épisode. Je sais que c'est compliqué pour certaines, parce qu'il faut maîtriser l'anglais, qu'il y a des termes techniques. J'espère quand même que vous aurez ressorti des choses positives de cet entretien qui dure à peu près une demi-heure. Si vous avez aimé, n'hésitez pas à mettre 5 étoiles sur iTunes ou sur n'importe quelle plateforme où vous écoutez votre podcast. N'hésitez pas à vous abonner. N'hésitez pas non plus à laisser des messages. Je les lis. Ça va continuer ce podcast. Je fais de mon mieux pour que tous les vendredis, vous ayez une conversation passionnante. Pour l'instant, je le dis, je le fais bénévolement. Donc voilà, ça prend parfois un peu plus de temps. Il y a aussi eu cette petite pause de 2 semaines. Mais pas de panique, je n'arrête pas pour autant. Il y a d'ailleurs des super choses qui arrivent autour de ça. Donc je suis très contente de pouvoir aider tout le monde et surtout les parents. À très vite, à vendredi.